Kia ora everyone, and welcome back to another week of VOTE 2023. My name is Charlotte Werner and this is Liam White, and today we're joined by the Honourable Rachel Brooking, the Labour List MP for Dunedin's electorate, who is currently serving as the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries and as the Associate Minister for Food Safety in the 6th Labour government.
We thought we'd start off with some very quick fire questions, just so we and our audience can get to know you.
Great.
So firstly, this is a bit of a tricky one. Could you give us 3 adjectives to describe the Labour Party?
Caring, sensible, and motivated.
Okay. What is the main reason you became a politician?
The main reason I became a politician is that I very much care about long-term planning for climate change in particular. And I've been political all my life, spent a long time out of politics, and then in 2020 had the opportunity to become involved again, and I'd been reviewing the whole of the resource management system, which was really interesting, and I'd been a lawyer for almost a couple of decades, and it seemed like a good time to enter the political realm.
Yeah, cool. If you had to join another New Zealand party, which would you join?
The Greens.
Yeah, fair enough. Who is your favourite Member of Parliament?
And it's allowed to be in my party. It's not one of those trick questions for other political parties. I've got so many. I came into Parliament already with Aisha Verrill being a good friend of mine, but I've met so many amazing people. So people like Barbara Edmonds and Tangi Utakuri, and I could probably name my whole class of 2020 Labourites. So it's just been a joy to work with so many really good, smart people.
Yeah, absolutely. Now here's a tricky question for you. Who is your least favourite Member of Parliament?
Oh no!
They can be in your party too as well if you
like. You can pick yourself if you so feel.
Definitely not in my party. Well, you know, I really don't like anything that the ACT Party says, and so it's probably only fair that the leader of the ACT Party would then be my least favourite Member of Parliament. Not for any personal reasons, for
policy reasons.
Disagree with everything that they say.
Yep.
Okay. So now getting a bit broader, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing Aotearoa today?
I do think it's climate change, and I think it's all of the climate change things, so both mitigation in terms of reducing our emissions, and for all of our exporters to know that they're going to have to do that if they want to be able to trade with well-paying international markets, and also the planning for adaptation, both transitional things around jobs and that part, some physical matters, but also how we come to terms with a lot of change that will happen. We don't know exactly when it will happen because climate change comes at different speeds. So we have heavier rainfalls at the moment, but we know that at some point there'll be some sea level rise, but we don't know when or how long. Depends on how the world cuts its emissions. So we can't know. So how we are able to deal with that fairly to make sure that people can go elsewhere and are looked after, but also that we don't set up perverse incentives and have poorer people who might be taxpayers funding wealthier people who might be property owners. So there's a lot of trickiness in that, and that's something that we have to be talking more about.
Moving to sort of constitutionally, do you think New Zealand should become a republic? The classic question.
Yeah, I'm a fan of a republic. For a long time I was of the view that it would be quite tricky because of our treaty arrangements, but I think Dean Knight's done some good work on Twitter convincing me that there are ways to do that while still respecting the treaty and different arrangements that need to come out of that. So I don't think it's insurmountable, but also I don't think it's the most important thing for New Zealand at the moment.
Okay. Now the BuzzFeed classic political question, who is, in your opinion, your favourite Prime Minister And what do you think is their single greatest achievement?
Probably, and this ages me a lot, would be David Lange. And because I was a child when he was the Prime Minister, and he was very funny, and once he might have come to my house, or I sort of saw him as a child as well when he was at his prime. And I think bringing New Zealand together over the nuclear-free issue was a good issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is perhaps the toughest question we've had to ask you before we move on to your work as the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. Oppenheimer or Barbie?
Oh, I haven't seen either of them.
Oh.
And yeah, that is the problem.
I think this interview's done then. You've got some movies to watch, eh? Yeah.
I really want to see both of them. I've had different members of my family see either one of them, and one of my children's managed to see both of them. And I think, though, the one I want to see first is Barbie.
Good choice.
Cool. So I'm going to read a little bit here. On Thursday morning, you announced plans for 6 new marine reserves between Oamaru and the Catlins, a move that will increase the country's total area of marine reserves by 2/3. Since the announcement, there has been worry over accessibility issues for recreational and commercial fishing interests. What is your response to this?
So there's been a very long process to get those 6 marine reserves, and I'll just note quickly that the decisions on marine reserves are made by the Minister of Conservation, Minister of Oceans and Fisheries, and so I do a concurrence with it as Minister for Fisheries. But that process started with the Southeast Marine Protection Forum back in 2014 and has been chugging along with various different stops along the way since then. So lots of different stakeholders were involved in lots of different times since 2014. So, of course, commercial interests are always affected by any marine reserves, and that's something as Minister of Fisheries I look at really carefully in terms of if there's going to be any undue disadvantage to those commercial fishers, and so I have advice around that, and it was looking like maybe in one of the marine reserves it could have met that test of undue, but at some point in the process the boundaries for that marine reserve got changed. This is an area called the Church, and it's a deep water area where rock lobster are in particular, so that was decreased, the area of the marine reserve, so that they can still catch the rock lobster there. So I think we answered that question. And then in terms of the recreational fishers, there are lots of places still available for recreational fishers.
Yeah. So the current proposal that you've come out with would be set up through an order in council and gazetting process, which is unlikely to be complete until mid-2024, which means whatever the incoming government has the potential to scrap the initiative completely. So how would you advocate for the marine reserves to go ahead in the next government in the event that Labor does not come back into government again?
The hopefully highly unlikely event, but,
yep.
But I hear the question. So the SEMP process, so the Southeast Marine Protection Forum, that was started by Nick Smith when he was National Government Minister. And certainly as I've been the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries, when I've been questioned about different issues, the National Party representatives have been questioning me about where the SEMP process is at. And also National did want to get the Kermadex done as well. That was started under their watch as well. So I'd be very hopeful that National would look at the very careful process that has happened in this area and keep going with it, with that order in council.
Perfect. So what level of protection would these areas have, and does this protect marine biodiversity? Yeah,
so marine reserves are highly protected, and so you can't do fishing in them. So that's a good thing for biodiversity, and there's been lots of international research that shows that if you have marine reserves, then you get benefits outside of the marine reserve space. So should be great for biodiversity generally.
Perfect. So what do you think is the central biggest issue facing New Zealand fisheries?
The one I hear most about is bottom trawling as a method of fishing. And so you might be like me and not have been on very many fishing boats. And I have now. So you have on the back of your fishing boat, you have these gates, which are quite heavy metal, and then the net goes. They go on either side of the net and trawl along our benthic environment, so the bottom of the seafloor. And that's in part because of the type of fish that we've got in New Zealand. That's where they like to live. So about 67% of the fish that are caught commercially are trawled, are bottom trawled like that. It obviously has some negative impacts on that benthic environment. So the commercial fishers will say, well, 2%, it's only 2% of the of New Zealand's waters that they do that method in, and normally trawl in the same areas. But sometimes the environmental groups will say, well, then you won't mind if we shut all these other areas to you that have got high biodiversity. So there's a constant tension there with the bottom trawling, and also some international markets are looking at it as well as a negative way of fishing. But I think we need to have a more nuanced discussion about it, and where it goes. If it is destroying highly vulnerable ecosystems, then it shouldn't happen in those areas as a general principle. But if it's happening in areas that have been trawled for a long time and maybe have the muddy bottoms already and aren't particularly representative, then we should probably focus our efforts on other good environmental methods to get better bang for buck.
Yeah, so on trawling, Greenpeace has a petition to send you a message about the banning of bottom trawling on seamounts. How can Labour or how can the government make sure that we're profiting from our fisheries sector as well as acting in an environmentally conscious way? And do you think that these objectives can be achieved simultaneously?
Yeah, I do absolutely think they can, and that's part of the challenge of the job and makes it really interesting as well. So in our manifesto, switching to my spokesperson hat, we do have that we would ban bottom trawling on those vulnerable. So this petition is talking about seamounts. It's in the EEZ. These are little mountains in the ocean that have a whole lot of corals and other things on them, and they're also where a lot of juvenile fish like to hang out as well. So they're important for the whole of the cycle of the fish's life. So we're saying that on areas that haven't been trawled before, new areas, we'll ban it, and then areas where seamounts and highly vulnerable ecosystems in the EEZ that are currently being trawled, then we'll phase that out.
Yeah, great. So where do you think climate change and oceans policy intersect? Do you think the ocean acidification is a problem around New Zealand, and how does coastal erosion fit into the picture? There's a lot of coastal erosion in Dunedin at the moment. How do you think this all works together?
Climate change for the ocean is terrifying, and it has all sorts of consequences. We're already seeing some of that with marine heat waves and what that's doing to different flora and fauna in our oceans environment. So we've had little penguins washing up in the far north. We've had kelp dying in some places, and all sorts of bad things. In terms of coastal erosion, yes, we have that, and sedimentation in general is very bad for our ocean environment. So if you get runoff, so a whole lot of silty stuff in the ocean, and you have seaweed, and then the silt is on top of the seaweed. Seaweed needs to photosynthesize. It can't do it if there's lots of silt in the way, and then often those kelp beds will die, and that is a habitat for juvenile fish and other things. So that's all very bad. So we need to look at what's happening on the land as well.
Yep. And
we've done, Labour's done a lot of work in terms of its essential freshwater package to try and stop particularly rural runoff with the essential freshwater package, but then also with the affordable waters, or the three waters, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of doing better with stormwater is an important thing as well in more of the urban environment. So trying to stop that. Some coastal erosion though is going to happen because of weather events that are out of control, and that has really severe impacts on our marine habitat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Sounds like you have a lot of thoughts on fisheries and climate change. So moving on to beautiful sunny Dunedin. You're a Dunedinite through and through, so it's safe to say you know us fairly well. Historically, Dunedin has been a very red electorate since 1928, we found in our research. and you're campaigning very hard to keep it that way. But you've said that you are not taking anything for granted. But this week, Francisco Hernandez told the media that it's a two-horse race in Dunedin between Labour and the Greens. What do you have to say about this?
Definitely not taking anything for granted. And of course, in 1975, it did go national. And the Greens are running a really good, strong campaign. And look, the thing I love about Dunedin is that it's really a progressive place. And so if we're fighting about who can be more progressive, that's a great fight to be having. I don't know what to say about it in terms of hopefully I'll keep campaigning hard and people will come out and support Labour like they have in the past, and that's really all I can say in terms of I'm not I do read friends' tweets. That might be a mistake for me, but it is very motivating as well in terms of he's campaigning really hard and good on him. And so that's motivating me to continue to campaign as hard as I can as well.
Yeah, it's looking like it's shaping up to be a good wee race down here. I just want to move on to the topic of tertiary education. It's obviously very important to Liam and I and our viewers. So in the past, you've said how it's a priority of yours to review the tertiary education funding to support our exceptionally important university and Polytech. So what would this look like in practice? Would you increase the funding if Labour came back into government next?
Yeah, so Labour's said before the manifesto and things came out, so it was more at the time when both the University of Otago and the University of Victoria were both saying, oh my goodness, we're going to have to do a lot of cutting. And so there was some extra money that went in at that time, and also this promise to review the tertiary settings. For me, I think that review needs to be fulsome. It needs to look at the role of the Tertiary Education Commission as well. And we've had Grant Robertson talking about how we need to reassess the bums on seats model too. And, really probably look at the role of universities and where they sit in the framework compared with the Polytechs, because we've had that big review with Te Pukenga, and relationships as well with employers and so I think the more things we can look at in that review, the better, really. But of course, I want more money for the University of Otago, because I'm parochial, if nothing else. And it's a wonderful institution, and universities are so important to the fabric of particularly this city, but also the country as well.
Yeah.
And we want wonderful young people to come through and be inspired to do lots of different things in the world. And the job markets are changing and the world is changing, so having it might be that it does need to be more multidisciplinary, or that we're really focused on training people up to be nimble, to be able to do a whole range of different things. I'm not an educational expert though, so I would leave that for the people who know about these things to do.
Yeah.
So this week, the critic slammed students for very poor participation in our student elections. You were, of course, OUSA president. I was wondering how you thought student politics have changed since when you were president to now.
I'm not sure that they have changed that much. Like, it's always been cyclical, that there's been more engagement and less engagement randomly from year to year sometimes. And you get people who are really committed, and you get a cohort of them, so who might make quite a lot of change for a couple of years, and then it sort of simmers down again. And some of the issues are the same but different. So, because I was the student president so long ago, when I was a student, you weren't allowed to drink until you were 20. So that was an issue that was going about. Of course, we also had compounding interest on student loans when you were at university, so it was about 7.5%. And so whilst you were studying, your loan just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, same issues in terms of that students have now, in terms of not being able to afford all of the rent and the food, and not having student allowances for that many students, and paying lots of fees. They haven't seemed to have changed that much. Of course, good that there's that first year free though, and now that interest isn't charged on loans when you're at university. So So I don't know how much that has changed.
So pretty similar, you're saying?
I think so. I mean, different issues with student culture because, there's not a student bar at the moment. I know that was an issue for the new OUSA president, and I really don't know what the answer is for that. And with student culture, obviously today we've had a pretty horrific story on the front page of the ODT about a student flat initiation, but also I've been out with the Friends of Sophia doing the street cleanup today on Castle Street, and just see so many wonderful students doing so many great things.
It's interesting to see how times change and how they stay similar to
And there's there's 20,000 students, so there's always going to be subcultures within 20,000 and differences in there.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to quickly move on to the topic of the hospital. It's obviously been a big contentious issue with the hospital cuts that it's been tasked with. So earlier in the year, Labor obviously announced those cuts in efforts to rebalance the budget, and they subsequently did kind of a U-turn on that announcement. So National has pledged to continue the funding for the Dunedin Hospital project. As an MP, what action would you like to ensure the hospital continues to be funded?
So a couple of responses to that question or statement. The first is, of course, that you can't trust National on any infrastructure building whatsoever because they have no track record of doing infrastructure apart from large roads and broadband. Good on broadband, to be fair. In terms of what happened late last year with the increase in funding of 110 million but saying, well, we do need to save 90 million because we've had a 200 million over expenditure, or whatever the phrase is. So that did change the pavilion that was on the building. And, it's hard to justify things that are nice to have when the whole country needs new hospitals built as well. So the hospital, we've obviously, though, being a local MP, we want it to be to provide for all the clinical outcomes that were promised at the start. So in terms of beds and theatres and those issues. And it's doing that, and it is $1.68 billion, which is a huge amount of money. I think most people can't imagine how much that is. And it's really important that we do it and we do it well. But the biggest healthcare issue in New Zealand at the moment is the workforce. And that's crucial as well. It's all very good to have a nice new building, and it will be an amazing building, and committed to following that through. But good to see more numbers going into med schools, into dent schools, into nursing as well.
So you agree that, so workforce is the biggest issue here. Do you think Labor is doing enough to improve health outcomes across the board?
Yes, Labor's working very hard. There's always more to be done, but we are if you look in the global context, there is a shortage of medical people across the world, and we need to train more, and we need to incentivise them to stay in New Zealand as well. Also, I'm married to a medic. It's important that people can go overseas and come back as well, but to get that extra bit of training that you can get offshore.
What do you think Labor is doing coming up in terms of building that workforce?
So increasing the numbers at Otago and Auckland med schools is one of the things, and we've increased a lot of the nursing numbers as well, and also increasing the dental students. So that's one thing, looking at different methods of sort of bonding of students as well as another. And also I think really important thing is encouraging the work that certainly the University of Otago has done now over at least the past 10 years of increasing the population of Māori and Pacifica students going through those different health sciences, because they're also likely to work in communities where we really need staffing. Perfect.
Well, that was all of our questions. Thank you very much for coming in, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you to our viewers in the audience. Thank you to our viewers at home. And early voting is, of course, open. It opened on the 2nd, and it's open until the 14th. So please, everyone, get out there and vote. Thank you very much for being with us today. Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to another week of Vote 2023. I'm Liam, this is Carly, and today we're interviewing Francisco Hernandez, former OUSA President, Principal Climate Change Advisor for the ORC, Senior Analyst at the Climate Change Commission, and Green Candidate for Dunedin. G'day, friend. Welcome to our show.
Morena.
Now, just to start off our show, we'd like to ask you some quick-fire questions to learn more about you and your party.
Sure.
So, could you give us 3 adjectives to describe the Greens?
The Greens are democratic, principled, and committed.
Perfect. Wow, you came up with those really quickly.
Yeah.
What are your top 3 priorities if elected?
My top 3 priorities, if elected, will be to be a strong voice to stand up for local services here in Dunedin, such as pushing back against the cuts to the university and the Polytech, to advocate for green policies such as the wealth tax so we can rebalance wealth and fund for free dental, and to push for climate action in South Dunedin and wider in Otago and across the Aotearoa.
What is your proudest achievement or your fondest memory at Otago University?
I think my fondest achievement when I was at Otago was probably being OEC president and putting in things that really helped alleviate the cost of living pressures that students were facing and still face at the time. So when I was OEC president, we put on free breakfast for students, but we also started a service called Scarfy Shuttles that bought about $10 airport shuttles. So the point of that was to start a bit of competition with the local shuttle providers and force them to lower their prices. And we saw a little bit of that as well. And obviously the cost of the free breakfast was directly alleviated the kind of cost of living pressures that lots of students faced back then.
Sweet. So moving on to some a bit more hard-hitting questions. So we can see obviously that some students are very engaged in politics, but most aren't, despite having very real political interest in renters' rights, climate action, and we're seeing now with tertiary education funding. So my question is twofold. Why don't students seem to be engaged? And if you were a student today, how would you boost engagement?
I'm still a student today. I'm studying part-time, but I think most students are engaged, but they just don't have the right amount of time. I mean, two in 3 students in the people's, the people's well-being into and the People's Inquiry into Student Wellbeing, that identified 2 in 3 of students were facing real pressures on in just affording the basics like groceries, heating. So if students are facing these kinds of pressures, then they're not going to have time to engage. So the best way to actually encourage students to get engaged is to alleviate the cost of living pressures. And I guess that's why parties of the right don't have any kind of interest in alleviating the cost of living pressures, because they know that when students aren't tired, distracted, they're more engaged, and they don't want that kind of thing to be happening.
Wonderful. Well, the University of Otago has been in a financial black hole recently, with staff being made redundant and courses being cut. How do you propose to help the university's financial troubles and other universities in New Zealand that might be struggling?
Fundamentally, the troubles that the University of Otago is having is something that's being replicated right across the public services here in Aotearoa. And the way that we can overcome that is by rebalancing the wealth through a wealth tax. I mean, we've seen in this pandemic era, I mean, you look at the research done by people like Bernard Hickey, and he identified that the asset holders in our society increased their wealth by nearly 1 trillion during the pandemic era. And while that's happened, the public services have been underfunded. I mean, we've seen terrible waiting lists in the hospitals. We've seen terrible job cuts here at the University of Otago, but also at the Polytech across the road. And these things are happening because we've allowed ourselves to buy into this paradigm that we can't tax the wealthy somehow, that somehow they're allowed to get away with making super profits with the banks and the corporations and the ultra wealthy at the expense of working people and of students and of people who are struggling. So I think that's terrible, and we need to stop that through the wealth tax.
Yep, and do you think a fees-free model would be better?
Absolutely. The green policy is to move towards that fees-free model, and moving towards seeing education as a public good rather than this kind of for-profit model that we currently have.
Perfect. So we can all agree that student housing is pretty poor. The NZUSA survey indicated that 1 in 6 students were living in flats that didn't support their needs but couldn't move due to financial pressures. What support would you give to students there?
So the Green Party has a pledge to renters, which will make sure that that we move all flats to that livable standard, but also that we stop the price gouging that landlords are doing by putting in a rent cap of 3%, and also making sure that that applies to new tenancies as well. So landlords will have to disclose what they were charging previous tenants, and the way that we'll enforce that is through a landlord register, just by making sure that, that we're actually tracking what landlords are doing. We're able to kind of enforce that rent cap across tenancies.
You presided over the previous national government's decision to make student unions voluntary. Should they be voluntary?
No, I think we need to move towards a model of universal unionism, and not only for student unions actually, but for broader workforce unions, because we know that unionized forces stand up for their members and stand up against the rampant exploitation that's done by some employers. So they're a shield against cuts, and they're a shield for better wages and better conditions for their members. So absolutely yes, universal unions.
So the Greens have proposed a guaranteed student income of $385 for all students. Could you explain how that sort of would be operated and how it's funded?
So the guaranteed minimum income of $385 a week is funded through the wealth tax. So we're going to rebalance wealth and make sure that every student receives a minimum of $385 a week. So obviously, if you work, you'll be able to get more than that. And if you get the accommodation supplement, you'll be able to get more than that as well. But the guaranteed minimum income is just a floor that kind of no student is able to slip through.
Awesome. So we know that the Greens have been a strong advocate for Make It 16. With your website reading, a strong representative democracy is one that extends the voting age to include 16 and 17-year-olds. So we went around campus and we asked students for their thoughts on Make It 16.
What are your thoughts on changing the voting age from 18 to 16?
No, probably maybe not.
No. No, because I know that I definitely knew nothing about it when I was 16.
I don't think you're mature enough to vote at 16.
I think there's some aspects of it that I think could be really good. I feel like when I was 16 I probably didn't know enough to actually have a vote.
Yeah, I feel like I'd probably just vote with my friends, like not really actually having a proper opinion.
When I was 16, I wouldn't have really cared, so just keep it at 18 when you're an adult.
The last election when I was still in high school and it was the first time that I could vote, it was really drilled into us. We could really learn about everything, and I think to get people that interested at a really young age can be really good and kind of teach them how to learn about it.
Because I suppose it's quite important that you know what you're voting for, I suppose. So maybe if you're 16, don't know what you're doing as much.
On the other hand, 16 is really young, so I don't know how formed opinions can be at that age when politics is kind of the last thing on the mind, on the other hand, but yeah.
So from that video, we saw that students are generally pretty sceptical about Make It 16. I was just wondering what your response to that is.
I think we should definitely still move towards making it 16. We can engage, if we engage people from the high school onwards, they'll be able to make better informed and more educated decisions and learn about our political system much more. And also, right, like we don't put kind of IQ tests or information tests on voters for very good reason. I think that leads down to a very dangerous path. So yeah, quite frankly, I've met some 16-year-olds who are really, really engaged, and I've met some 60-year-olds who aren't very engaged, and I still think that they should be able to vote regardless of their level of engagement or knowledge.
Do you think that system would put more pressures onto teachers who are already overburdened to teach students more about civics education?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's something that can be integrated within the regular curriculum. I think if you design a civic engagement modules in an intelligent way, you're able to kind of integrate it into the standard curriculum. For example, history or social studies, or maybe even math with counting votes or whatever.
Would teachers be required to have training in civics education before delivering it in schools?
Yeah, I think, as with teaching any subject, I think teachers should be supported to be trained in whatever subjects they're delivering, and that includes civic education.
And if you do support the policy of engaging younger people, what are your practical plans to implement that engagement process and educate younger people more on why they should vote?
Part of that engagement process is obviously being done at the teacher level, but some of it will be done by bodies such as the Electoral Commission and also by supporting NGOs and community groups, because we know that kind of peer-to-peer role modeling is the one that works best for engaging students. So, through kind of these 3 engagement methods, we'll be able to engage students into voting at 16 if such a bill does come to pass.
So you have mentioned education and teaching. Would that mean the Greens would be focusing more on implementing, say, school programs based around politics and voting in at high school levels?
Yeah, that's one of the ways that we can do that.
So now moving on to some more Dunedin-specific issues. There has been a proposed $90 million tax cut to Dunedin Hospital, which has been proposed by Labor and then supported by the National should they come into government. What's your position on the Dunedin Hospital cuts?
The Greens support a fully funded hospital rebuild. I think the sort of service cuts that have happened are terrible and should be reversed. And I think it's a symptom of how we underfund our public services, right? And it's a symptom of how desperate the wealth tax is really needed so we can fund strong local services.
So Dunedin is a very car-centric city. I think that's pretty easy to say, even though we do have some amazing bike lanes. And I was wondering what your thoughts as to the benefits of moving to a public infrastructure-based infrastructure model.
I'll definitely support that. Our Climate Safe Communities Plan will put in about a $800 million fund to support public transport provision and increasing the amount of bus routes that can happen. So definitely support moving towards active and public transport, and that climate safe infrastructure travel plan that we've got on our website will move towards that model.
Awesome. Do you think we could see a return of the Southerner?
I'd love to see that happening, and I'd also love to see wider regional rail services. We used to be able to take passenger transport to central Otago, and I think that's something that should be supported because, rail is one of the ways that we can get around in a low carbon friendly way. So that should be supported.
And would you also support the use or the increase of use of electrical vehicles as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And with the provision that shifting towards EVs is good, it's better than ICE vehicles, that's internal combustion engine vehicles. But they don't fundamentally, with EVs, an EV vehicle still takes the same amount of space on the road as an ICE vehicle. But we're really wanting to move towards public transport options and also active transport options to give people more choice. And I think that's beneficial not only for the people who are biking, who are now safer, or the people taking public transport where it's more convenient, but also the people who need to drive with less congestion on the roads, because the more people you have biking and the more people you have on buses, the less cars there are on the road. So that's still beneficial for if you still have to drive, for example.
Perfect. Now, in the previous shows, we've had students express their concerns about climate change. What do you believe are the main obstacles to New Zealand's growth or progressiveness towards reducing climate change?
I think the main obstacle to New Zealanders overcoming the barriers towards climate action is the lack of investment. And that lack of investment has come from decades of government deprioritizing climate change. But the way that we can do that is by urgently centering climate action. So I'm really proud of the fact that in this term of government that the Greens have been able to achieve some strong climate wins, such as ring-fencing the Climate Emergency Response Fund funding, such as passing the Cross-Partisan Zero Carbon Act and setting emissions budgets that have been approved by both National and Labour and the Greens and basically every party in Parliament except for the ACT Party. So that's a strong foundation for climate action, but we really need to accelerate that further and faster. And the way we get that is by electing more Greens in government, but also at a local level as well.
Yeah, and typically A common stigma around the Green Party is that they have been slow to action and slow to implementing policies that see the change, and especially with New Zealand's 3-year cycle. Do you think this government, if the Greens were elected into the Parliament, do you think they'd be able to increase that acceleration of policy?
I think that's exactly why we need to elect more Green MPs, because in the Labour majority government, the Greens have had not much leverage because Labour can just pass any legislation they want. So I think with this, the majority Labour government shows exactly why you need more Greens there holding the balance of power and leverage, because we've seen in this term of Parliament Labour making cuts to the climate funding. This year I think they made $250 million worth of cuts to things like reducing waste emissions, to things like research on agricultural emissions, to things like active transport initiatives. And those things are things that the Greens would have fought if we'd had the votes to be able to fight against that.
So you discussed previously how the Greens didn't have a lot of leverage to work with Labour. You also mentioned that working with the National Party on the Zero Carbon Act, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what you think the Greens' opportunities to work with a national government would be, looking at current polling which show National clearly ahead.
There's, unfortunately, other than the general policy direction, which is that climate change is real and we should act towards it, there's very little overlap between National and the Green Party. If you actually look at what National are proposing, they've opposed basically every active climate policy that this government has proposed, from active and public transport initiatives to things around decarbonizing the energy system, and they've even proposed delaying the implementation of pricing of agriculture, which is our biggest emissions. That being said, historically, the Greens have been able to work with National on certain areas of climate policy. You raised the Zero Carbon Act as an example of that. There's also some consensus that we were able to achieve on the national cycle paths under the key government. So I'm confident that if voters give us strong leverage and elect as many Green MPs as possible, we can be a positive influence and a progressive influence on whatever government that's elected. But obviously our preference is a Labour-led government.
So we currently regulate under the emissions trading scheme. I was just wondering if you could very briefly, as the perfect person to probably explain it, sort of how this system works and maybe some key problems with it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, big question.
Yeah. So the emissions trading scheme is a scheme that's been designed around the idea of market-based solutions. So polluters around New Zealand, once they reach a certain threshold, bid for what's called NZUs, or New Zealand units. And in theory, these people bidding for NZUs are meant to be driving the cost of carbon up, which means that if you have a high price of carbon, or basically a price on carbon, that disincentivizes the use of it. So for example, if you're a business and you're, for example, having to pay, $50 million to operate a coal boiler, you see that on your balance sheet. So that's meant to be incentivizing you, for example, to switch towards solar power or wood power or something else. So that's the theory behind it. But in practice, the system has a lot of flaws behind it. So for example, agriculture, which is our biggest emitter, isn't currently in the emissions trading scheme. And the second big problem with it is that you can purchase these NZUs. You don't actually have to reduce emissions. So if they're at a low enough price, you just purchase NZUs, which are New Zealand units. And that effectively means that you don't actually have to reduce emissions. You just keep purchasing these at a low enough level. In theory, you shouldn't. In theory, at a New Zealand scale, you shouldn't be able to keep doing that, because the theory is that there's a cap on emissions. But there's 150 million NZUs from kind of previous rounds that are just floating around, which means that effectively that the emissions are actually not capped. In practice, in theory they are capped. The other kind of obstacle with the kind of perfect theory of the ETS as well is that future governments can just keep adding NZUs as they want. So even though in theory there might be a cap on it, like in practice, there's nothing stopping like governments from adding like more NZUs to the market. So this is why the Greens have pushed for like active climate policy that actually reduces emissions today rather than relying on abstract policy mechanisms that might kind of work to reduce emissions on paper, but not actually lead to real emissions reductions. And the other kind of problem with the emissions trading scheme is that it's encouraged the growth of wildling pines right across Aotearoa. And I mean, I think there is a place for sequestration or for wildling pines or trees, but the current market incentives are such in that I don't think that the settings are currently right where they are, and they've led to people planting their way out of emissions rather than actually reducing emissions on the ground. So that's emphasizing that sequestration over the gross reductions or actually reducing emissions on the ground, which is what we actually need, and which is what will be more transformative for Aotearoa and what will create the industries of the future. Sorry, that was a really long.
Thank you for that. It's interesting that you actually brought up the market. Do you think that we're able to properly combat climate change with these mass corporations perhaps contributing as opposed to just the agricultural emissions that we're seeing?
I think New Zealand exists in the context of a market-based economy, and the world exists in the context of a market-based economy. As such, market-led solutions will have to be part of the mix, the policy mix of how we reduce emissions.
And if seemingly every other country besides New Zealand has failed to properly tackle climate change, how are we supposed to follow in their footsteps, or are we just following a normative international structure?
I don't think that's true that countries are failing to deal with climate change. I think we are failing to deal with it as aggressively as we should be, but the curve of emissions reductions around the world is bending downwards. For example, the UK, I think, has managed to reduce their emissions by quite a lot from the base year, and the European Union as well. So there's lots of good success stories internationally. In China, they're rolling out electric cars and solar panels at a really rapid pace. So I'm really optimistic that with more international cooperation and with more action on the ground and with more pressure from the public, we can take stronger climate action.
Does the green policy on GMO adequately reflect opportunities for climate-resistant crops?
I think that links back to the answer that I gave previously, is that we need to look broader than climate change, because there are opportunities that are offered in genetic modification to reduce emissions. But the problem is that, for example, if you apply GM ryegrass, there's been trials that show that, they can reduce emissions. It's all about, and this is a terrible phrase that I remember from my time at the Climate Commission. To reduce emissions, there's to reduce agricultural emissions from ruminants, there's two ways you can go about it. It's by breeding and feeding. So breeding is you look at the animal genetics and you kind of breed towards successively more and more emissions, like lower emission kind of breeds. And feeding, you change the way you feed animals, and the GM comes into the mix for both of them. The issue is that while yes, they do have the potential to reduce emissions, it doesn't really look at that kind of broader issues associated with that industrial scale of agricultural production. So for example, even though the emissions might decrease, you're still kind of polluting the riverways. You're still kind of extracting a terrible toll on the soil, and you're still kind of extracting it on the basis of foreign labor and the labor of the farmers who actually do work really hard. So we need to transition ultimately away from that extractive single-use model. And while GE can address some of the problems, it's not a silver bullet.
How do you reconcile your priorities to the environment and biodiversity and people? We know that the Greens argue that this goes hand in hand, but there are instances where these are mutually exclusive, such as we mentioned the economy earlier, and businesses potentially having to lay people off to reconcile their commitments to the environment.
I think they do go hand in hand. I think we can transition to a clean green economy and generate tons of jobs and opportunities along the way. And I'll give you an example of that. In the waste sector, the current model we have, which is to landfill, is that linear extractive pathway. Whereas we know that investing in resource recovery generates 4 to 5 jobs for every job in landfilling. So if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like rather than just having, some guy, well, more than some guy, people on trucks taking away your rubbish and then putting it in landfills. If you had people who took the recycling and then sorted it and then reprocessed it to make new products rather than kind of extracting new things, you generate more opportunities along the way. So yeah, I think the opportunities for social justice and climate justice actually come hand in hand rather than being separated.
You have mentioned agriculture a lot as one of the targets for the emissions, and obviously agriculture is a really large export for New Zealand. So how are we able to, or how will the Greens formulate a plan which both reduces agricultural emissions but make sure we're still getting our exports out?
So the way we reduce emissions in the agricultural sector while still generating strong exports, there's different ways you can do that. But the Greens are determined to support the farmers who are doing the right thing. And there's real value in that clean, green image New Zealand has. So if we move to a lower emissions model, to a lower emissions and lower volume model, we can get that green premium. Because consumers overseas are increasingly wanting climate-friendly goods and services. And it's actually part of the deal that we've recently signed with the European Union, and that that New Zealand is really strongly encouraged to move towards that lower emissions model. And we're seeing a lot of market pressures as well. Like for example, Nestle has set an emissions reduction target for themselves, and that includes the milk that they buy. So there's strong incentives towards moving towards that clean green model, and that's the model that we want to be moving towards.
Awesome. I'm sure we could talk all day about climate change, all the Greens initiatives there. I was wondering if we could move to a discussion of tax.
Yes.
So you mentioned a wealth tax earlier. The Greens have also proposed the first $10,000 income tax-free. I was just wondering how you think those two initiatives specifically would help students.
Those two things will help students because the wealth tax will enable us to rebalance wealth away from the really wealthy who've seen their profits and who've seen their net worth increase during these kind of so-called cost of living crisis, which I actually call a cost of inequality crisis, because we've seen that the people at the very top have actually seen their living standards increase, whereas the people in the so-called squeezed middle, but also the crushed bottom, seen their wages eroded by inflation. So the wealth tax is needed to support strong local services, such as free dental, such as free public transport for students. But the tax-free threshold of $10,000 as well will be great for students, because that will apply to the universal student allowance, which will also fund through the wealth tax.
Awesome. So in our research, we found that a lot of the Greens policies were predicated on the wealth tax, and it really seemed the key to the Greens policy. What do you think will happen if, we've seen resistance to the capital gains tax, similarly to a wealth tax. What is the Greens' plan B if they can't get a wealth tax through?
Fundamentally, we believe that the wealth tax and the need to tax capital is the way that we can move forward as a society. At this moment, the way that we get that through is by making sure that we elect as many Green MPs as possible. Fundamentally, the question is really about, the Prime Minister has said that he's ruling out a wealth tax. Well, we don't accept that. We think that it's up to the voters to rule what they want in or what they want out. So we're asking voters to give us a strong vote so we can get a wealth tax through and really rebalance wealth.
According to two News Hub polls, we saw that 53% of Kiwis support a wealth tax and 54% support a capital gains tax. Why do you think there's such resistance in Parliament to push through these very popular ideas?
So there's resistance in Parliament because a lot of the people in Parliament are themselves ultra wealthy, right? Like a lot of them have multiple properties and a lot of them will be negatively affected by the wealth tax. But not only that, a lot of the parties such as National and ACT are funded by people who would be harmed by those policies. For example, we've seen Graham Hart just this week donate something like $700,000 between to the National and ACT parties. I don't think that I've even made $700,000 in my life, let alone just be able to just casually drop it just like that. So yeah, I think we're seeing opposition because a lot of the ultra wealthy in New Zealand are trying to buy our politics, and sadly, a lot of the politicians are allowing themselves to be bought or are too cowardly to stand up to those moneyed interests.
Awesome. We've talked about a lot of complicated issues today, and I was just wondering, what distinguishes the Greens from the Opportunities Party, who are seemingly taking a pro-environmental stance and targeting youth voters?
I think the thing that distinguishes the Green Party from top the most is that we come to things from that kind of values-based approach and that holistic approach to politics that I think top is a kind of very technocratic party, whereas the Greens kind of come from it from a more principles-based approach, and those principles include centering the planet and centering the people. So, our kind of tax policy would benefit working people more compared to the kind of middle-income earners that the top party is prioritizing. And the other difference is that the Greens are definitely going to be in Parliament and influencing the direction of the next Parliament in the next government. I think a vote on top, I don't believe in the idea of a wasted vote. I think you should vote with your principles, regardless of whether or not your party is going to make it into Parliament or not. But I think a vote for top at this stage of the election cycle is a risk. We've seen in the latest poll that came out this morning, the top was polling at 1%, which is the same level of polling that parties that are anti-vaxxer parties and that are at the fringes of society are polling at the moment. So yeah, it's a gamble at the moment, and a vote for the Greens will definitely ensure that your vote goes towards shaping the direction of the next Parliament. And that's the difference between us and top.
Lastly, in one sentence, can you give us why New Zealand should vote for Green?
People should vote for the Greens because the Greens are the only party that's committed to rebalancing wealth so that we can fund for strong local services, climate action, and cost of living adjustment for students and everyone else who needs one in Aotearoa.
Thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today, but we'd just like to thank you for coming on our show and also thank the production team and our viewers. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time on VOTE 2023.